Chapter 8. The Pit of Starvation. The castle was not silent. It did not slumber early in the morning as Vickers began his self-guided tour, but it took its rise slowly. The dinner guests were still locked away in their chambers. Count Conradin was already working at his desk, with papers and ledgers piled about him, as Vickers discovered when he stumbled across the castle's study. Servants were lighting fires and setting about the home all the things that the household required. Martin's talk was over, and the Count bore a different air during the infant hours of a humdrum day. Oh, he was still kind to Vickers, still delighted to host him. But the face of a businessman, with worldly concerns of every sort, wished the young Tannhäuser a good morning that day. The same rich, oily voice that greeted him on the bridge, but with a tone entirely bereft of the celebratory jubilance of St. Martin's Day. Vickers did not know what to expect as he roamed the castle that day, but it was certainly not this bold alteration in the Count's general air. An understated, "Good morning, my boy," was followed by an even subtler, "The castle is to be considered yours while you are here. Help yourself around. I will speak with you this afternoon." Vickers responded with a shallow bow and a whispered "thank you." He backed out of the study, rather than turning around and walking forward. He did so slowly, inviting the boisterous and exuberant Count he had met on the bridge to emerge through the stoic expression of the man in front of him. It did not come. The Count looked down at the figures on his ledger and scratched his head, comprehensively engrossed, as if Vickers vanished from the face of the earth the moment they broke eye contact. Vickers backed around the corner until the study and the Count were out of his vision. The awkwardness and disappointment evaporated by the fires of his curiosity. He was very interested in seeing the kitchen, the origin of the previous night's feast that fed so many, and bound in kinship and pleasure such a diverse company of rich and poor, of educated and ignorant, of nobles and commoners. He expected a grand and magical chamber, with unearthly spirits under the disguise of men and women, flying like the wind from counter to oven and back again. What he found was altogether different, but just as intriguing. The kitchen was not easy to find, and he refused to ask the many servants he encountered on his search. The aimless wandering brought him multiple times through the same corridors and into the same rooms. He learned much about the castle, and about those who called it home during the turn of 5 centuries. The walls of every room were adorned with relics of the castle's history. One room was filled with trophies from hunting expeditions. The heads of huge beasts were mounted on the walls, with bows and spears beside them, and plaques with the names of the hunters involved. Each plaque was marked with a date, from as early as June 828. Another room was devoted to the military history of the region. Suits of armor were mounted on the walls in styles from the late Roman Empire to the most current technology and designs. Some were dented and rusty and still wore the stains of battle. Some were clearly ceremonial and had never met an enemy's sword. In the military room was a scale model of the castle. It had soldier figurines and knights on horseback, sculpted and painted to realistic accuracy. This commandeered Vickers' imagination and took it down several fantastic and adventurous roads, while his eyes anatomized every precise detail of the model. Nagging him from just beneath the surface, and keeping him pressing forward, was his relentless desire to see the kitchen. He eventually made his way down to a long hallway. The first evidence of his destination came at his face in the form of wafting heat. This was among the oldest parts of the castle. The large, gray stones were ancient and well-worn. Vickers followed the heat. No rooms opened in the corridor. There were no doors. The hallway bulbed out on the sides, where things were stored. Nestled snugly inside the second of these bulbs was the castle forge. The blacksmith was already at work. A tall, thin man pulled on a bellows cramp that was so large it could have swallowed him like Jonah. But this Jonah had a friendly, playful relationship with his whale. He spoke with it, and giggled as he stretched his long body with the bellows inhale and curled into a tiny ball as he forced the exhale. The kiln responded, surging with glowing orange, and a rush of warm air blown down the long hallway with each contraction of the blacksmith's long body. Vickers' imagination stayed with the biblical metaphor, for the blacksmith appeared to be underwater. His long, wavy chestnut hair floated about his head, dancing in the hot vapors of the kiln. He was youthful in his gleeful expression, like a child at play with his friends, but a few wrinkles around his eyes and mouth. Happy wrinkles, the sort one develops after decades of excessive laughter, along with a scar that ran from his temple to his jaw on the right side of his face, hinted at a history that toyed with Vickers' imagination. There was something about this man, toiling away, glistening so early in the day with sweat, smiling and playing with his work like they were old friends, that held Vickers' attention with a covetous grasp. He was jolted free when that youthful face broke from his watery dance with his whale and turned to lock eyes with Vickers. The blacksmith broadened his smile as he nodded to his curious visitor, who responded with alternating steps sideward and backward, never breaking his stare until the bellows whale swam between them. At the very moment Vickers lost eye contact with the blacksmith, his senses were seized by another seductive magician. Wafting from the kitchen just a few steps behind him came an elevating, cradling, nurturing aroma of freshly baked bread. Vickers turned on his heels and united his eyes with his nose. The kitchen bulbed out from the hallway much like the forge, but on both sides. It capped the hallway like a sphere at the end of a scepter. It was not large, not grand in any way, except for the mood of its employees. The kitchen was small, but bustled with activity. This would seem to be the literal manifestation of the old hackneyed cliché, "too many cooks in the kitchen." But as Vickers watched them buzz about their work, he realized that the old saying had no place in this crowded kitchen. There are many organs in the body, thank God for them all. Each plays its own part while working in unison with the whole. Such was the case in the body of the castle kitchen. No stumbling, no bumps, no collision, just a tight flow of concerted chaos that volleyed our hero's eyes back and forth at a frenzied rate across the busy scene. Vickers thought of the Martinstock feast and struggled to imagine it all coming from such a tiny kitchen. His mind tried to cram every ham, every goose, every fruit and vegetable that flowed into the dining hall into the nooks and crannies of the small kitchen, but he could not make it fit. What miracle workers, he thought to himself. Where did it all come from? Far more intriguing than that were the attitudes and airs of the kitchen staff. Like the blacksmith, they seemed to take earnest joy in the duties assigned to them. They joked and laughed and cooperated as if their work was some beloved hobby they performed excitedly during their moments of leisure. One of the cooks took notice of Vickers and greeted him. "You must be our noble guest, the Tannhäuser." Vickers acknowledged the truth of the assumption and was immediately seized by the arms from many directions and rushed to a tall stool beside the counter. A voice came from behind him. "Thank you for visiting us in the kitchen. Here, eat." A calloused old hand, scarred from burns, reached around him with a plateful of warm bread, a thin slice of ham, and a wedge of cheese. Before he could begin to thank them, a mug appeared on the table, as if delivered by a ghost. It was filled with some bubbling, light green tonic. It had a distinctly herbal flavor, and sparkled in his nose. Vickers ate, and exchanged every polite pleasantry with his servant hosts, while they continued about their work, not skipping a beat. Precisely as Vickers lifted the last nibble of cheese from his plate, it was lifted away and whisked out of sight. He poured the last of the green tonic down his throat and stood from the stool, offering his gratitude and compliments randomly in all directions, for no matter where he looked, there was a cook moving at an inhuman pace. The woman who greeted him handed him 2 small rolls of bread and invited him to visit them whenever he desires, assuring him that a succulent meal would greet him any time, day or night. With a few firm pats on his back, which would have been grossly inappropriate from a servant in Castle Tannhäuser, the woman sent him back where he came, past the blacksmith and through the passages that led him to the kitchen. With a warm roll in each hand, Vickers continued his tour of the castle. He rambled up and down, inside and out, until he came across a curious room. At its center was a hole, a well of sorts, with a dark wood circular banister surrounding it. This curiosity became, in an instant, a mortification. A weak and pathetically mournful moan came from the hole. Vickers stood against the rail and looked downward. It opened into a pit, only the center of which could be seen from Vickers' vantage point. A man walked from the hidden extremities of the pit to stand directly under Vickers' glance. He wore only a short pair of pants, covering him just beneath the knees. He had no shirt, making his emaciated state all too visible. The bones of his shoulders seemed to poke out of him, like he was smuggling thin, poky tools under his skin. The spaces between the ribs were so sunken that their depths were difficult to determine. The man looked up at Vickers. He was no savage, no wild man to be isolated from peaceful people. A keen and undeniable intelligence shone from his eyes. A face of peace and understanding looked up from the pit to the confounded young guest. Vickers' mind scurried in 1,000 directions, trying to make some sense of what he was witnessing. What was this pit? For what crime was this man being starved inside of it? How could good Count Conradin condone such torture? Perhaps a full minute of frenzied contemplation occurred in poor Vickers' head before he recollected the bread in his hands. With no thought of consequences, in mindless obedience to his compassion, he tossed a roll into the pit. The man lifted his hand to catch the roll, but he was too weak, too slow. The roll bounced twice at his feet before his hand reached the height of his head. He bent down and picked up the bread and stared at it as if entirely unsure what was to be done with it. "Eat it!" Vickers growled down to him in a half-cry. The man squatted down and placed the roll ceremoniously in the center of the floor, directly under the opening. He looked up to Vickers with a face that expressed nothing. No gratitude, no pain, no confusion. He looked upward in this manner for a few seconds, then walked out of Vickers' sight, away from the offering. Vickers threw the other roll into the pit. It bounced out of his sight, and in the direction the man had walked. He waited to hear the sounds of bread being devoured by a ravenous beast. What he heard instead were slow and intentional footsteps. The man came back into view, this time not looking upward. He placed the second roll beside the first, while reciting in a parched, rusty, barely functional voice, "Not by bread alone shall I live." The man turned away from the bread, took one step and collapsed. He surely heard Vickers' sorrowful gasp, but he made no acknowledgement of it. He simply regathered himself and walked out of sight. Vickers' anger surpassed his decorum. He squeezed and wrenched the wooden railing until his hands blistered. He pictured the good count in his head, which ignited a fierce battle within him. He had a violent internal reaction to the conflicting thoughts. The man who knew and loved his mother, who greeted him so warmly on the bridge and fed the poor of the city from his own kitchen and clothed them from his own wardrobes, kept this dying man inside of a pit of starvation. Whatever this man's crimes, surely a just lord, a man of Christ, could find a gentler means of punishment. Such was the battle raging within him. These swirling thoughts, and the man's refusal to eat the bread, plus the very existence of such a pit, so clearly designed to torture, under the roof of a man who Vickers had so quickly come to love and respect, set his head to swoon. His knees buckled. If not for the height of the banister around the pit, Vickers surely would have joined the starving man. But he caught the rail with his armpits and struggled to return to his weakened legs. He returned to his room to find Father Stefan gone. He fell face first onto his bed and was unconscious before his body stopped moving. There would be no peaceful rest, no graceful repose after what he had experienced at the pit. With rigid muscles and tortured spirits, his dreams that morning were truly wretched. In his dream, a large man who walked and breathed and appeared from behind much like the Count, dragged Vickers by the wrist. Vickers could not see the man's face, nor could he get to his feet. He was being dragged too quickly to get his boots beneath him. Stomp and pound and thud went the massive boots in front of him, with determination that seemed distinctly malignant. The massive figure dragged Vickers through forests and old stone hallways, through deserts and over hills, until finally stopping at a white dune. In the middle of the dune was the hauntingly familiar wooden banister rail of the pit of starvation. Vickers knew his punishment, but not his crime. The man flung Vickers into the pit like he was discarding a chicken bone. With his face to the hole above him, he watched the banister rapidly reduce in dimension as he fell downward. He awaited the ground's painful strike on his backside, but it did not come. He continued to fall, until there was nothing at all to be seen above him, or in any direction. There was nothing for his eyes or his hands to grab, just nothingness in all directions. He closed his eyes and prayed. Suddenly, he became aware of the sensation of water pouring onto his head. He opened his eyes to see and feel a narrow fall of crystal-clear water, an infinite line of falling fluid no wider than his shoulders, falling at his rate beside him. But he could not see the beginning or the end of it. It came from some source far beyond his vision above, and fell to some depth his worldly eyes could not reach. He grabbed at the column of water, squeezing it with his hands and wrapping his arms around it. It responded as water does. It gave him nothing of substance to slow his descent. His arms and hands passed through it, but returned to him dry. Feeling no impact, he became aware of solid ground beneath him, precisely as he noticed the end of the sensation of falling. He sat in a grassy field. The column of water continued to fall beside him and pool around him. He was struck hard in the center of his chest by an inner sensation that was foreign to him. He loved the water. He could not explain how or why, not while he dreamed, or in his attempts to understand it after he awoke, but he loved the water. He wanted to be in it, surrounded and embraced by it. The column of falling water ceased, and the sound of it crashing against the rising pool around him suddenly silenced. Vickers stood as the water level rose to his hips. After the scene had gone still and silent, and he stood in an endless, glistening pool, he had an insatiable desire to taste the water. He cupped his right hand and drew a sip to his mouth. It was warm but refreshing. It soothed him and healed him, relieving him of every pain and sorrow, washing away bruises as if they were light smudges of dirt, and patching the holes in his troubled soul. He was complete and pristine. He was reborn. As comprehensively satisfying as the sip was, he craved more. The desire to drink was desperate, not because he was thirsty, but that he wanted the water inside of him, as part of him. He bent low to touch his eager lips to the surface of the pool, but as he lowered his head, the level of the water lowered in equal measure. His mouth could draw no nearer the surface. He dropped to his knees and continued to lower his head until every remnant of the magical water sank into the low grass and disappeared beneath him. He mourned the loss of the water, like it had washed away with it everything beautiful, everything worth celebrating, everything capable of being enjoyed in the world. The grass was dry, the ground beneath it also dry. He dug his finger beneath the blaze and into the dirt. Nothing of the water remained. It was gone from his life forever. He buried his face in the grass and begged it to come back to him, but the only fluid to be found was Vigorous' own tears, which also disappeared into the soil beneath his knees. Vigorous awoke in his bed precisely as he knelt in his dream, with his cheeks soaked in tears and the same ache in his chest. As he elevated through those layers of consciousness between his dream and the tangible world, the ache in his chest subsided, but the memory of it remained with him for weeks. Vigorous stood from the bed in time to hear a knock at his door. 2 quick taps were all that preceded the opening of the door, just wide enough for the Count to squeeze his abundant cheeks into the room. "The cooks told me you have already eaten well. Unlikely you'll need lunch. Do as you wish, my boy. I must eat lunch and I will come for you after." He smiled so widely at Vigorous that his broadening face pushed the door open further. Vigorous returned the warm expression with one of embittered confusion. Ignorant of Vigorous's encounter with the pit of starvation, and misunderstanding the boy's grimace, he amended, "Unless, of course, you are hungry, or would like simply to sit with me while I eat." "No," Vigorous retorted sharply, before containing himself and adding more genteelly with an undeniably forced deference, "No, thank you, my lord." The Count raised an eyebrow and forced out a quick sigh, and reminded Vigorous, "Whatever you like, the castle is yours while you are here." Vigorous thought loudly inside of his own head. "If it is mine, I wish to free that man from the pit, and to fill it in so that it is never used again." By the time this thought finished, he was thinking it to the inside of his closed door. The Count was off to lunch. Still disturbed by the lingering sensation of his dream, but focusing more clearly by the second on the more disdainful, Vigorous paced his chamber, alternating rubbing his temples and his eyes, with more force than could do him any good. His paces quickened until the room could no longer hold him. He burst from the room and marched with determination and unchecked zeal for the pit of starvation. With his senses and his wits heightened, he found the room directly. He ran to the pit and placed his hands on the rail, but leaning backward so that he could not look inside. Something inside of him forbade another look at the starving man, but his thoughts were intensely on the poor soul. So intensely that his heart flew into his throat when a firm hand took his shoulder. He spun around and stumbled backward, almost falling into the pit. The Count caught him by the wrist and pulled him squarely to his feet. With a laugh in his voice that Vigorous found disturbingly irreverent in such proximity to the pit's pathetic captive, the Count said, "Whoa now! If you decide that you want to go into my pit, I'll gladly lower you myself, but best not to go in head first." Vigorous took this as a threat, and shivered in a moment of intense fear. He only relaxed in remembering the Count's affection for his mother, and the fact that Father Stefan was charged with bringing him to the Teutonic Knights. He could not just disappear into the castle's cruel pit. The realization emboldened him enough to confront his host. "How could you do this? I have seen the man in there. If he deserves death, kill him. But what crime can deliver a sentence of starvation?" The Count's jovial face turned intensely grave. "You misunderstand, young man. He is not a criminal. He is a friend." The fear returned to Vigorous's skin, where it waved inward until it shook his bones. He scooted quickly to the opposite side of the pit, placing the circular banister between them. The Count's face softened with compassion as he asked, "You fear me, young Tannhäuser? Why? What do you think is happening here?" The Count was so genuinely sympathetic, so authentically concerned for Vigorous's state of mind, that fear evaporated in an instant and was replaced by curiosity. I don't know. That is to say, I can't imagine why... It was clear to the Count that Vigorous was shaken out of his wits, and was no more capable of constructing a coherent sentence than of eating the entire Martenstock feast by himself. so he decided to go directly to the point. "The man in the pit is Andreas. He is the son of a nearby baron and friend. Andreas wishes to join my knights." Vicarus slowly shook his head back and forth, still unable to make sense of it all. Conradin continued. "I tried to deny his entrance into the pit, but he insisted upon it." "I saw him," Vicarus shuddered. "He asked for this?" "It is the only passageway into my army, the only passageway to heaven. If not this pit, then some other." "Some other?" "Mark these words, my boy. Mark this moment, for you will never hear more profound advice from these lips." The Count's solemnity of tone and severity of expression sent another wave of chills through Vicarus. He continued, "There are many varieties of beasts in this world. Some run around the wilderness on 4 legs, scavenging for survival. Others walk on 2 legs through the streets of civilization. Of those, some reek of the gutters and wear ragged, dirty clothes. Others are adorned in the finest garments. Some wear the robes of the clergy. Others ride on horseback in polished armor. But do not mistake them for humans. They are beasts, only thinly removed from the wolves that run through these forests." Vicarus, paying close attention and taking quickly to the lesson, began an internal inventory of everyone he had ever known in order to place them into the category of either beast or human. He struggled to tell them apart and asked the Count how to know one from the other. "Beasts are driven by the desires of the wild and the satisfaction of physical pleasures. Fear puts them in a mindless frenzy, and to survive, they will commit unspeakable horrors. Humans are spiritual, children of God, and well beyond that which mandates the behavior of the beasts. Our spirituality lifts us beyond the physical. This pit does not make you human. Rather, it reveals the beast, if a beast lies within you, that you may battle it. But is pulled from the pit will either be fully beast, or an angelic creature who requires only that divine nourishment of God, entirely free from the shackles of the physical world. They will be at peace, and have, through their inner eye, the vision of God." The Count assumed an ominous, frighteningly foreboding tone, and with a drastic deepening of his voice, he walked around the banister, took Vicarus by both shoulders and spoke. "You must face the pit. If not this one, then some other. Your humanity will be tested by this world, I can assure you of that, and your spirit must raise you above the animals." Vicarus looked into the pit and back again to the Count and asked, "Have you been in there?" "My father put me in when I was 12. With mortified compassion, Vicarus commented more to himself than to the Count. "That is terrible." "No," the Count quickly retorted. "It was painful, not terrible. It was glorious. The beast in me was weak, and it yielded readily to the spirit, which raised me above the hunger to the saints. I took my place among God's cherished children. When I was lifted from the pit, no pleasure or pain, fear or desire in this world could hold me tightly. I can enjoy the pleasurable, but it will never grip me tightly enough to force me into evil. That, my son, is what the pit does for us." Vicarus looked into the pit. The man inside revealed himself and looked upward. The Count allowed a moment of contemplation in his young friend's head before adding, "Would you deny this man his divinity?" Vicarus was about to answer when the Count continued, "And will you deny yourself when your time comes?" Vicarus continued to stare at Andreas, who stared back with deeply darkened and sunken eyes. But the horrors of the physical form no longer spoke of injustice or cruelty. Oh no! Someone quite heroic stood shakingly beneath him. Health looked upward at him, spiritual health, liberated from the ravages of desire and fear. It was a look familiar to Vicarus. He saw that bliss in the blacksmith and in the cooks. He asked, "Is it only your knights who face the pit, or do others who work for you?" With his penetrating vision, the Count asked, "You recognize it, do you? The tests of God are not mine to allow or deny. Anyone who desires it may have it, but I require it of some." Vicarus blurted, "The blacksmith!" "Ah, you've met Ricard. Nobody has ever stayed down so long. Now he is the happiest man I have ever heard of." "And the cooks?" "Many of them. Most of them. Yes, most of them have faced the trial." This thing that Vicarus thought to be such an evil was the explanation for the true majesty of Mearsburg Castle, for the servants who reached over nobles to share in their feasts, for the playful joy with which the blacksmith and cooks performed their duties, for the delight taken in serving the poor. Andreas was the latest to join them. The Count lowered a rope with a knotted loop at the end. Andreas sat in the loop and was pulled from the pit by Conradin's powerful arms. Andreas did not go directly to the dining hall, as Vigoris expected. He stopped at the chapel to thank God for his transcendence and for the good Count who facilitated it. End of chapter 8.